Welcome to this edition of Washington Policy Center's Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I am the Communications Director for Washington Policy Center. In this episode, we'll be speaking with Jason Mercier, our Center for Government Reform Director, about all that's going on in Olympia. In fact, this is the Olympia Watch edition, which is great because it's named after Jason's Twitter handle. If you follow Olympia Watch, you're following what's happening in Olympia through Jason Mercier's very capable eyes. We'll talk with him about what's happening tax-wise, budget-wise in Olympia, what to expect in the coming days, as well as in some of the other government reform kinds of areas like the governor's emergency powers. We'll be talking about those things. I want to remind you that during the webinar, at any point, if you have a question, there's a question function at the bottom of your screen. Just enter your question in the Q&A box there at the bottom of your screen. And then after Jason and I talk for about 20 minutes or so, we'll be getting into your questions. So ask the question at any point in time. There's no limit on that. You don't have to wait for your topic to come up. Ask it at any time, and we encourage that. And then we'll get into an extensive Q&A section afterward. I'd also like to remind you that this is part of an ongoing series. So every Tuesday, Washington Policy Center has a Washington Policy on the Go event. Next week's the Legislative Lunchbox event, typically involving legislators in a conversation with our Eastern Washington Director, Chris Cargill. Those air live on Facebook, so you can go to our Facebook page and watch that live as it happens next Tuesday, same time. And then we'll be back with you the following Tuesday for another episode of Washington Policy on the Go Olympia Watch. Right now, I'd like to bring forward Jason Mercier, our Center for Government Reform Director and longtime friend. Jason, it's great to see you, even though once again it's all these fake virtual screens before us. But I guess you've been calling for remote testimony forever, and the ability for remote testimony. Now we get to live that dream. But it's got some ups and downs. Has it, by the way, been improving? The last time we talked, there were some problems with the people's testimony getting cut off early or in mid-sentence. Has that overall improved after some public pressure?
Yeah, so Dave, as you mentioned, remote testimony, we've been pushing it for many, many years, and I would not have wished a pandemic on anybody to finally get here, but we are here. So I'm grateful that now, hopefully, it is here to stay. It depends upon the committee, it depends upon the chair, it depends upon how controversial the bill is as far as how this process has been working. Overall, I think it's been going fairly well. The lawmakers have kind of learned how, this is new for lawmakers as well as for citizens testifying. But I think they've gotten through that you don't automatically mute people at a minute. That's probably not the best way to engage with citizens. So we haven't seen that happening anymore. There have been some controversial issues where people may not have been treated the most fair. I know there's actually been some potential ethics complaints filed, whether those are frivolous or not. We'll find out what happens at the legislative board. But overall, I think we're where we should be at this point. But again, the remote testimony was never to replace a physical live session. You miss out a whole lot, the energy, being able to have that personal touch, what the hairdressers did a few years ago, overwhelming the Capitol, kill a bad bill. But as far as remote testimony goes, I think we've got the bugs worked out, and hopefully it is here to stay.
Yeah, that was the one problem I had with many who were pointing to the Washington Policy Center and saying, the Policy Center's been calling for remote testimony, so it's a great idea. I thought, well, I wish you would have listened to it for many years in a row before now. But they were kind of citing it as though it's the standalone, the only thing. And as you point out, it's one additional tool that is important for the state to have. And you also bring up an excellent example, which is that hairdresser bill where a lot of hair professionals got together to kill a bill because they were able to show up personally, and they would not have had the same kind of emotional and visceral impact if they had just gotten online and signed up. And so it's kind of, I understand it from a political power play, but it is disturbing to see so many different bills that I think people would react very strongly to going forward in a session where the people's power, and remember all powers reserved to the people under the Washington State Constitution, the people would react very strongly and want to protest. And yet, there's a lot of these bills going forward in Olympia at a time when, their arms are held behind their back, basically. They can't show up and protest. whereas, legislators can push forward anything that they want with a lot less consequence, and a lot less visible consequence, which is important to political folks. So,
it's really hard. You can't read the room. You can't feel the energy. When you're testifying remotely, which I've done a few times, you're basically staring at your own screen. You can't see the senators. You can't gauge their reactions to know if you're missing a point or there's a better way to hit something. Now, again, that's going to always be true with remote testimony. I don't want to imply in any way that this should not happen going forward, but it is a component of a fully transparent and open legislative session. As soon as we don't have to have remote sessions, we should stop doing so.
Yeah. Now, since we're talking about some of the limitations that are on the session, that brings up the idea of the emergency powers of government and the pandemic itself, particularly the emergency powers of Governor Inslee, who's basically, he's been, the one-stop shop for all things government, for the better part of a year until this latest session. We're a state that did not call for an emergency session for the better part of a year, even though clearly there's an emergency going on. And there was some talk that legislators, and I suspected that legislators would want to reassert their authority and their significance as elected representatives of the people and directly responsible to the people, that they would put some limitations on the governor's power and at least require their approval to certain things and require emergency sessions or emergency approval in some way. Has there been any reform in the emergency powers, and is there likely to be any reform in the emergency powers? What's happened with that?
Perhaps the only thing that's been more surprising about the income tax on capital gains, which I know we'll get to in a moment, is the total lack of interest by legislative leadership of the majority party to assert the legislative role as a check and balance in these decisions. It is crystal clear. We are now past both the fiscal and the policy cutoff. Not a single one of the multiple emergency power bills moved. They are all dead. So unless leadership decides that they at some point want to assert their constitutional role, we are going to go through this session with no changes, none, to the status quo of how these decisions are being made. And I say that this is surprising because for a couple of reasons. Just on the standalone policies that we have right now in the state of Washington, there was a national study ranking all 50 states, and not a review of how the governors exercise their powers or whether or not they made good decisions. It was strictly a review of the balance of power. Does the legislature have oversight at some point over a governor's emergency powers? And in that 50 state ranking, Washington came in the bottom 4 as the less amount of legislative oversight. It's pretty much a one-person show, just structurally. So with that context, you would expect to have seen just some institutional reactions. And we know if you look across the country, in fully almost supermajority Democratic states of New Mexico, of Hawaii, of New York, you see Democratic lawmakers saying, we're the legislature, we have a role in this, and we're going to take back some of our power. For whatever reason, that is not happening in Washington, and it is just truly puzzling.
Really shocked me too. I fully expected, particularly, we have one party rule for all three, for both houses and the governor's office. So I did not expect any kind of political resistance to that idea. And typically, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, you've been a longtime follower, typically legislators tend to flex their, even at the federal level, tend to flex their, hey, we need to reassert our authority in this area. And I fully expected that to happen this session. It's been kind of jaw-dropping to me how willing people are, because the current leadership has been, to basically surrender that authority to the executive branch.
Again, you think about the constitutional separation of powers. What are the roles of our branches of government? The legislative branch, the people's elected lawmakers, are the ones that are supposed to set policy, to determine what is supposed to happen. And it's up to the executive to implement the policy. These emergency orders have turned that on its head, to where it's the executive determining everything. And, you could agree 100% with every single decision the governor has made, and you still should be deeply concerned by this lack of balance of power, because that's just not the way laws and policies are supposed to be made. And, I'm here in the Tri-Cities, and you may recall, while everybody else was told they get to move to phase 2, for a few days we were told, sorry, not you. And that was because of a data error. A single hospital made a data error that kept 6 counties locked down. That should not happen. And what's just terribly concerning is if the legislature does not do something, again, it's not a matter of saying, Governor, you don't have any power, you can't respond. But after 30 days, 45 days, 60 days, whatever it is, at some point, the elected branch of government should have a say in this. And my concern is if we go through the end of the session with no changes, we're going to be on a yo-yo. There's going to be changes in metrics. What is this, Plan 7.0 from the governor on reopening? And if there's not a legislative check, we're just never going to know any given week what the ground rules are.
Yeah, I was also disturbed because, businesses like the one that keeps coming to mind for me was the drive-in theater over in the Oak Harbor area in Island County, where if you're governor, that's one small area and easily forgotten in the midst of a large state bureaucracy. But if you're a state senator or a state representative, that's a big business in a larger part of your community. And you're going to be more responsive to this idea that, hey, the rules that are applying now to indoor theaters are applying to a drive-in. That makes no sense, right? So that would move in advance. Instead, they had to rely on media coverage and getting to the brink of bankruptcy before they got anybody to pay attention. And they got lucky, so to speak, that somebody paid attention. So, I just thought that it was a no-brainer for legislators to reassert themselves in some way. So very disturbing. You mentioned there that we could get through the end, without seeing any change. But these bills, although they're dead, they don't have to remain dead. Is that what you're saying?
So, the cutoffs are kind of a good indication of what leadership wants to move, right?
Right.
But we have our own miracle max in the state of Washington with an NTIB bill, right? Necessary to implement the budget. And that's one tool lawmakers can use to revive dead bills. But realistically, anything leadership wants to move, they can manipulate the process enough to move it. So nothing is dead until sine die, but it's very clear. Not even having a floor debate, not even execing these bills out of committee lets you know where the decision has been made on this. And the governor says no changes are necessary because he's made the right decisions and the evidence is in the outcomes. Well, if that's true, we can save a whole lot of time and a whole lot of money and make government super efficient just by abolishing the legislature and let the governor do education and healthcare and taxes and environment, right? Or no, is there a public process with 147 lawmakers that engages the citizens because not one person has all the answers to allow an exchange of ideas? That's the way policy is supposed to be made.
Yeah, you mentioned bills moving. The income tax on capital gains has been moving, and we will get to that in just a few minutes and where it is and what we're looking at. But since we're on the topic of moving metrics and the governor's power, we should also talk a bit about phase 2 and phase 3. It reminds me of the now dominant Disney/Marvel cinematic universe, where they are talking about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 of all these superhero movies, and they've charted them out for years. And so you'll find if you look at a movie that's 10 years old, they had little Easter eggs, plans for what was coming in phase 3 in these films. And yet when it comes to state disaster relief, which has also been prepared for decades, as they've had drills and other things that are supposed to be preparing the state for such things, we still don't have a phase 3. We don't know what phase 3 looks like. We have a phase 2, which is changed metrics, as you alluded to earlier, multiple times, but we don't know what phase 3 is. Is that correct?
Yeah, we don't know because right now the governor is calling the shots and he doesn't know. He's been repeatedly asked, what is next? What is the next step? How do we progress down the road as the infection rates decrease, as hospital rates drop, as more vaccines become available? What is the game plan? There is no answer because that's not in their thought process right now. So again, if we go through this session with no change in this balance of power, you might as well just get a magic 8-ball. You're gonna have a better idea figuring out what's gonna happen from that than trying to wait for the governor to come out with a plan.
And it gives the governor the ability to choose winners and losers in a phase 3. He could slow some areas down and speed other areas up because you just don't know what he decided to do. And he doesn't have to call a special session. If he goes forward, we're in perpetual emergency until he decides that we're not. Am I wrong?
Well, I don't mean to make this sound like it's an attack on the governor, because he is doing every single thing the legislature has empowered him to do. They have given him this power. The question is, when that power was granted, you were doing this because of an earthquake, because of a volcanic eruption, an avalanche, a flood, a very restricted, time-limited, location-specific emergency. Nobody envisioned going on, well, now, is this a year of 2 weeks to bend the curve, right? A year of one person indefinitely making these decisions, which is, again, why, even though other states have more legislative oversight, you were seeing efforts across the country to put additional sideboards, because it is the legislative branch of government that's supposed to be making these decisions, not the executive.
Well, it seems to me the executive branch of this state has been concerned about the amassing of too much power at the federal level in the executive branch. So it seems like the same principle should apply at the state level for the executive branch, to remind at least, or the legislative branch, that they too should have that legislative oversight. So this brings us to the income tax effort. This is something that I feel it's funny. I feel I'll be talking to you about income taxes until you're old and gray, and at your retirement party, there'll be yet one more attempt to get an income tax in Washington state. But, it's the sense of deja vu people have that once again, the income tax is before us. And, but this time it's actually moved in the legislature, which is different from some of the previous proposals to impose an income tax in Washington state. What are we looking at in Washington state, and where is it now?
And so for the last 9 years, we have had this effort to impose this capital gains tax, to open up the door to a full-blown income tax through the courts. And it's been a tax in search of justification. The reason for it has changed every single year. They just want to get it passed. We have public records showing why this is the case, which we can talk about in a little bit. But up to this point, it has never really been a real threat. The Senate has always been the backstop against this. There have never been the votes for it in the Senate. And even though the House has occasionally passed this out of committee, the full House has never taken a vote on this. They've always said, hey, we have the votes, but they've never actually shown that. They never voted on it. What makes this different this year, and this threat level, it is real, it is alive. There is a Senate Rules meeting at 1:30 today, and you can see this bill get pulled. The Senate did something this past week that it has never done. And it was a little bit concerning. Actually, it was about a week ago. On a Sunday, they put out a notification that a few days later, on Tuesday, over that 3-day President's Day holiday, the Senate Ways and Means Committee was going to exec, which means vote out of committee, Senate Bill 5096, which is the income tax on capital gains. And they did that. That has never passed the Ways and Means Committee. And you don't do that unless you think you have the votes to pass it off the floor. And I can tell you, if this passes the Senate, it will immediately be ratified by the House, because the votes are in the House. So the fact that you've got this through the Ways and Means, the fact that it's currently sitting in rules, means this could be a very quick vote in the full Senate to put this bill through.
And this brings us back to what I brought up earlier, which is bills that would create a public roar like this. Here we have the legislature operating on a holiday weekend when the people can't actually gather because we've got restrictions, COVID-based restrictions. And then this income tax on capital gains passes out of the Senate Ways and Means. So, there's to me that there's not a recognition of the hardship on the public to let their voice be heard in this current legislative session, based on the number of different very controversial bills that are going forward that would otherwise, I think, stir up a louder public opposition, including this one. We do have our income tax, by the way, for those of you who don't know, we have a petition right now calling for keeping Washington income tax free. You can find it on our homepage at washingtonpolicy.org. That we'd encourage you to share that with friends, neighbors, coworkers, whomever it is that you know who's interested in keeping Washington income tax free. Just click on the What You Need to Know section, and it's right there at the very top of the What You Need to Know section. A link's right there. We've had about 7,000 people in the last few days sign it, and we're hoping for a whole lot more.
So what's a couple of other things about this, what they're doing on Senate Bill 5096 that is different from previous years. The substitute they adopted has zero connection to the budget, none. It is standalone. They can pass that without any connection to the budget whatsoever. In my 20 years of following the legislature, I have never seen a tax committee move a major tax bill before the revenue forecast, which again indicates this has no connection to state revenues whatsoever. And in fact, there was a press conference yesterday by the Democratic leadership, And they were asked a couple of things. This bill has an emergency clause, no connection to the budget. The tax would not even go into effect until next year. Not a cent would be collected until 2023, yet it has an emergency clause. And why that is significant is we have a constitutional right to veto any bill the legislature passes. It's a right of referendum, unless there's an emergency clause. So this tax, divorced from the budget, no connection to state revenue, wouldn't go into effect till next year, has been deemed an emergency to deny us our right of referendum. And at that presser yesterday, the Senate Majority Leader was asked, why are you doing this knowing that you have a balanced budget, you have 7% revenue growth, you had a $500 million increase in the February collections, you've got a March 17th revenue forecast coming out where you can see $1 billion plus increase in revenue, you're getting federal funds, why are you doing this now? And the Majority Leader just said point blank, this has no connection to revenue. We just need to get this passed so we can go to the courts if we're allowed to do this.
And what we know from the emails that you obtained, that the goal through the courts is to broaden the income tax.
And there, you can't have they call this an excise tax. And I know we have talked about this in the past. An excise tax is a transaction tax. The way they're describing this, they're describing a financial transaction tax. That's not a capital gains tax, as the IRS in every state in the country. And in fact, the actual text of the bill makes clear you're not taxing a transaction, you're taxing income. So when a court looks at this, they can't rule it an excise tax because that's not what this is, but that's not the goal. The public records from lawmakers make it clear the goal is to strike 100 years of case law saying you own your income, that income is property. And then they can impose a broad-based graduated income tax without a constitutional amendment. And that's their own public records. That's their own emails. You don't have to take my word for that.
Now, since we're on the topic of taxes, I know the income tax has been near and dear to your heart. It's been a major effort to keep Washington income tax free from Washington Policy Center over the years. And we haven't given up on this one yet either. We've got a major marketing campaign underway right now regarding the income tax. But it's not the only tax that's been brought forward. Yesterday, our Washington Policy Center's Elizabeth Hovde testified against the sugary soda tax and pointed out the various flaws and the arguments in favor of the soda sugar tax, including that it was going to cause economic hardship for the very populations that they claimed they most desired to help. You can watch that also on her latest blog at washingtonpolicy.org. But what other taxes are being proposed, Jason, in addition to the income tax? What other taxes look like they're moving or have surprised you as being introduced this session?
I don't know if we have enough time to go through them all day. But so again,
I lost track of them all myself. I've been asked that question. I said I literally lost track of what was happening, and I started to get depressed getting your emails. So I'm relying on you.
I've lost some track myself. So again, here's the current budget situation. Budget is balanced. Revenues are growing by 7%. Monthly collections are up. We are getting federal funds. And with that context, you have 3 separate bills to impose an income tax on capital gains. You have a wealth tax bill, which doesn't exist anywhere in the country. And in fact, France repealed their wealth tax because their left of center president said, we have to make sure we stop driving French people out of the country. So we got a wealth tax on the table. You have the statewide soda tax. You have taxes on all wireless devices. We keep hearing rumors of a bill to put the Seattle payroll tax on compensation statewide. You have a carbon tax. You have a low carbon fuel standard. And then in the transportation budget, you have gas taxes, vehicle fuels. And I feel like we passed something about $30 car tabs. Oh yeah, there's a vehicle fee car tab increase as well.
That is just astounding, And by the way, we should point out that the gas tax and the fuel taxes, some of which are fees technically not collected by government, but would end up costing you anyway. So I'm just shorthand calling them a tax. There are significant increases it's not a couple cents that on the gallon that we're talking about here. You're talking about huge leaps in costs over the next few years in the cost of fuel, all of which is being talked about in the context of a pandemic that has hurt a lot of businesses and a lot of individuals as they struggle to stay alive. Let's get to the revenue forecast. You mentioned you expected to see $1 billion increase perhaps in state revenue, and that's coming right up. What's the deadline for that, and why do you expect such a big boost to state revenues?
Yeah, so March 17th is the revenue forecast. That's when that's basically usually the time you'll start to see the budgets come out very quickly, even though I know both the House and Senate Republicans have proposed alternative budgets that are balanced without tax increases. But we haven't seen the majority Democratic budgets yet. So you'll probably see that after the March 17th forecast. Why I'm expecting, again, this is just me reading the tea leaves, but why I'm expecting that potentially $1 billion plus increase is every month since the November revenue forecast, you've seen hundreds of $1 million come in above forecast. And that was with the state essentially locked down. As we have more economic activity occurring, you're going to see higher tax receipts coming in. We also know that since the November revenue forecast, it made no assumptions about the second federal COVID package that we received. Those monies have already been spent. That was one of the first bills the governor signed, the $2.2 billion being dispersed out. That revenue forecast made no assumption of that. So that's going to have an impact on economic activity. And we are still hearing about potentially another revenue package coming from the federal government. So a combination of finally opening up the economy, the monthly collections, and the federal funds all point to even more increases in that March revenue forecast.
And you point out that in this increase in revenue, that they've divorced the income tax on capital gains from this revenue projection or the budget at all. But with all this extra money coming in, it should give people pause. They might wonder, then why so many taxes being proposed? Has there been an answer to that from the majority party?
So the argument that they give is the wrong people are paying taxes. So we want to have tax increases on other people. The issue with that from a tax policy standpoint, if your concern is the low income are paying too much in taxes, how do you fix things just by increasing taxes on somebody else? Should you not instead target relief to those individuals? And we've actually repeatedly made these recommendations to lawmakers. Is our tax code perfect? No, there are tweaks. You have base problems in the sales tax. The B&O tax is a tax that pyramids. You should make changes to that. We have excise taxes, real excise taxes, not income taxes, but real excise taxes on gas, on liquor, on cigarettes, what they call the sin taxes. Those are the highest in the country. Those are very regressive taxes. There are things that need to be tweaked, but we don't need to blow our system up. Again, we're seeing that revenue growth. You're not seeing that in every state across the country.
See, that's interesting that you bring that up, because one of the things that you shared was a list of CEOs that were, and a quote from a high-tech CEO that said, look, Washington State's losing money just by talking about this income tax on capital gains, because these new companies and the startups are not going to be here, because it's complicated how we compensate employees for coming here, highly skilled employees, super talented people that are in a high-tech industry whose skills are sought after, to get them to come to a startup instead of a solid company like a Apple or Amazon or something. It requires different methods of compensation that would then be taxed by Washington. So, when people say, hey, look, some of these rich people aren't paying enough taxes over here, and yet our revenue keeps going up, there seems to be a disconnect as to what that revenue pays for. And that if you increase the tax, it means some of these people won't pay a dime because they'll never be here.
Right now, we're one of 9 states right now without a personal income tax. And Californians are fleeing the state because of the tax and regulatory burden. This is, I think, among the first censuses they've actually dropped in population. They're going to lose congressional seats. And we get phone calls often from California individuals saying, hey, I'm ready to buy a home in Washington and start a new business and bring my employees with me. But what is going on with these tax debates in your legislature? Now, I can easily go to Nevada or Texas instead and know that they're not trying to take this away. And for over a decade, the Department of Commerce ran this marketing website called Choose Washington, trying to tell people, come here, bring your business here, bring your jobs here, because you're going to be at a competitive advantage of no income tax. Well, you know what? About a week ago, they totally scrubbed that website. They have purged it of all reference to no income tax. And next week, I'm going to get public records from them to see who ordered that, which will be interesting to see.
All right, we've got lots of questions coming in. I'd encourage any of you watching to enter your question in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen, one of the tools here for the Zoom meeting, and we'll try and get to your questions. Some of them are pretty specific, Jason, so I don't know if you'll be able to answer them all, but I'll ask them. And then if we don't know the answer right now, we'll try and get back to you at a different time. First is, it's upsetting to see how the House and the Senate members don't seek input from AWC or WSAC. See, this is government wonky. People use a lot of acronyms and have little to no knowledge of the total impacts of their regulations. One example is the Police Oversight Committee, in which King County has, and it has caused its own problems, which without talking to us, they can replicate the problems. Any comments on that?
Well, again, I think it's back to being in the remote session, right? You're not having that opportunity to have the connection one-on-one with the lawmakers. I mean, they're doing Zoom meetings, but the normal way that this process works in a legislative session is AWC and police groups and everybody else would have a chance to do what they call their lobby days, walk the halls, hit all the lawmakers, talk to the committee staff. So the fact that that communication isn't happening, I think maybe because of this remote session standpoint.
Real quick, for those of you watching, the income tax petition, the Keep Washington Income Tax Free petition, the link is in the chat function right now. So if you go to the chat function and copy that link, be sure, by the way, to share it with friends, because we're on a strict timeline. As Jason mentioned earlier, this thing could be pulled out at any second. So, we just don't know how much time is available for people to have their voices heard. Next question, has Senate Bill 5141, Environmental Justice Council, been defeated, suspended, or withdrawn yet? This bill is an environmental, constitutional, and individual rights disaster waiting to happen, he says.
So that I don't know, but I have the man for you. Todd Myers, our environmental director, probably will be tracking that, and they will make sure we get back to him on that.
Yeah, my guess is that we'll take that question, and Todd will end up emailing you there. Next question. So what do we as citizens do to get movement on those emergency powers reforms? My representatives are all Republican and probably already want it. Other reps won't care what I want, will they?
So, the Constitution is not filled with space filler, right? Every word in the Constitution has meaning. And Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution makes very clear that we are the sovereigns. All political power is inherent in the people. And that is why before the legislature is granted a single power, the people reserve for themselves the right of referendum and initiative. So at the end of the day, if the legislature decides that they don't feel like they should have a say in this process, the people maintain the right to run an initiative to change that balance of power.
Next question, will this recording be available? So much good information. Answer to that is yes, unless there's a technical malfunction, which we did have earlier this week, but we think we've solved that one. It'll be available on YouTube relatively quickly on the Washington Policy Center channel, as well as on Facebook. So if you check if you're following our Facebook page, or if you're subscribing to our YouTube channel, you'll be able to see this video. Next question, would this, and I take it he means here the income tax on capital gains, affect real estate taxes? How soon would it be implemented? Will the tax hold up under a constitutional lawsuit?
So let me take the last one first. I may be overly optimistic on this, but based upon the fact the Supreme Court has repeatedly rejected efforts by the legislature to call an income tax an excise tax, and in fact, last year, refused to even hear the Seattle income tax case, I still think that there is a majority of that court that's going to uphold prior precedent. But you never want to take that chance. I can tell you with 100% certainty, if this passes, it will be in courts and it will go through that process. As far as when this would take effect, underneath the current text of the bill, the infrastructure, because right now we don't have a capability, we don't have a state IRS. So they would have to create the infrastructure in the Department of Revenue to even administer and collect this tax, which is why if they think you're subject to this, you are required to submit to the state of Washington your federal income tax return and all the forms and schedules so they can verify that you pay it. It would be subject to next year with the first payment being due in April of 2023. As far as the impact on classes of assets, honestly, I don't care what that bill says because it's statutory and the very next legislature can come in and change it. So all that matters is if the door is open to an income tax, it will be expanded.
And that's the one thing that I think people forget is when people talk about the threshold of who it's going to impact or which rich people it's going to hit, that threshold is only good as the first signing of the bill, right? I mean, it could change at any time with a majority of majority rules, correct?
Correct. I mean, because none of us pay a federal income tax right now. That was passed in the 1900s to only impact millionaires, right?
That's right. It's a good reminder. It happens. All right. For those of you looking, I just shared the petition link again in the chat function. Next question. I'm very concerned about House Bill 1054, which would remove many of the methods, tactics that law enforcement can use. Does Washington policy look at bills of this nature? The answer to that is not typically. We don't generally get into those kinds of things because we have various centers of research. It's not because people don't care, but it's because Washington Policy Center tries to stick to the mission that it's already staked out and avoid mission creep, because we've got our hands full with the center directors that we have. So we do appreciate the concern. Can initiatives be signed remotely or online, Jason?
So the Secretary of State requires what's called a wet signature. So what can happen is you can print off at home the petitions, but you have to have a physical wet, like by pen signature. They don't take electronic signatures.
Yeah, so it's a nice compromise because it does give you the ability to print things at home, but you're still going to you can't use the electronic signature. Let's see. Does that mean that we can't repeal the income tax? I take that this is the emergency clause issue. We can't repeal the income tax on the ballot because of that emergency clause. Does that limit us in some way?
No. So again, we have two rights. We have the right of referendum, which is a veto of a bill, means the bill never takes effect. And we have the right of initiative, which can propose a new law or repeal an existing law. So if the emergency clause stays on the bill, the referendum is prohibited. You cannot run a referendum on it. We always maintain our right of initiative, though, but that is a higher signature threshold requirement.
And just to follow up, that means that if the bill's designed as an emergency, or they declare it an emergency and it passes, the initiative wouldn't be considered interfering with the emergency, even if it did ban income taxes of that kind?
The only restrictions that I'm aware of on initiatives repealing taxes is if they have already been bonded. That's what happened with the Sound Transit vehicle fees. This has no bonding in it.
Is there any threat that they would bond immediately that revenue?
I may have just given them an idea. So
yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, way to go. Next question. Have you heard any interest in running a referendum to ban emergency clauses or banning the abuse of it?
Now here's the trick. The emergency clause reform, which we have advocated for, would require a constitutional amendment. And we can thank the state Supreme Court for this, and believe it or not, the Seattle Mariners. Because you may recall in, I think it was 1995 or 6, the voters rejected funding a new stadium for the Mariners. The legislature came right back in and passed that tax anyway and had an emergency clause, and it was challenged. And in a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court said, whatever the legislature says is an emergency is an emergency. So what we believe should happen is what South Dakota has, another state with a referendum. If you want to attach an emergency clause, if you want to prohibit a referendum, it requires a supermajority vote of lawmakers. But again, that requires a constitutional amendment. Dave, I think you're muted there.
Sorry about that. There's a large train going by, so I muted myself for the benefit of all. There's, I just want to take the opportunity to plug the landing page that we have for income tax information. For those of you who are watching, if you go to washingtonpolicy.org, we have a Happening Now section right at the top of the screen, what you need to know. You click that and it lays out Jason's work on the income tax and the various arguments about the income tax, the nature of the tax, what it would do, all those things. You can get a lot of information there to share with friends. At the very top of that is a link to the Keep Washington Income Tax Free petition. I've also just shared that link in the chat function. Someone wisely pointed out that it was not appearing there. That's because I had it limited only to panelists. So I was just sharing it with people who I already work with. So that's that's my technical difficulty. I apologize for that. All right, next question. Can you give an example of the capital gains tax proposal, i.e. what income category gets taxed, and show the math? I have heard it's a fraction of 1% of the citizens who will be affected, but have not seen any calculation examples.
So again, this is why I would recommend not getting hung up in the existing exemptions and bases, because that can change. I believe as it's structured right now, it's a 7% tax on the net long-term capital gain with a $250,000 exemption, I believe. Has various asset exemptions. Part of the challenge with this, though, is it is in their creativity to try not to call it an income tax, they have separated out the structure of it from how every other state and the federal government taxes income, which is going to make it very challenging to administer as it is right now. Because again, you're going to have to try to parse out your federal income tax return and figure out which classes of assets Washington wants to tax, and then trust the State Department of Revenue doesn't mess up its analysis of that.
Yeah, and I'd also point out that income taxes largely, I can't think of an income tax that stayed or that grew smaller over time in government, right? You know, where somebody introduces an income tax only targeting a certain percentage, so you kind of get weighed down. Plus, you already dug up the emails that point out that some of the key advocates of this income tax are excited to use this as, you know, the proverbial camel's nose under the tent to broaden this income tax already. I mean, that's the real design of the thing.
And back to the competitiveness argument, the irony on this is if you listen to the proponents of this, they will say, well, 41 states have a capital gains tax. No, they don't. 41 states have an income tax, and capital gains are income. And that capital gains income may or may not be included in that base. And several states actually offer a credit or exemption to where the capital gains portion of income is not taxed. So we're kind of going the opposite way of saying, well, we're not going to tax wage income, but we're going to tax the income that we're trying to reinvest into a state through, you know, job creation. So it really would be a massive competitive disadvantage to have the only standalone income tax on capital gains in the country.
There's two questions I want to merge together here, Jason, which is how can a non-emergency be called an emergency? And what's the threshold to attach an emergency clause to a bill? Because I think people get confused by that. People who don't follow, you know, policy and politics as closely as you do. So give them the bad news.
So the threshold to attach an emergency clause to a bill is, am I scared the voters might overturn this? Okay, this is an emergency.
Anything that they want to declare an emergency, as legislators, they can declare it an emergency.
That's what the Supreme Court has granted them.
Yeah, and so the only thing that would go against them on that score is a voter indignation, basically, people being disgusted with what they've done. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. Next question: assuming the income tax passes, what are the options?
Well, there are three options. The first one is not going to happen. The governor vetoes it because we know this is a priority for him. The second option is a lawsuit is immediately filed, which I can guarantee will happen. And then the third option, and this could be a combination with the litigation, is somebody files an initiative just to outright ban state and local income taxes.
Next question: how can we get clear graphics of spending and tax collection trends in front of our friends, neighbors, and other voters?
So this is actually something that we got the legislature to pass, I want to say in 2008. It is the state's budget transparency website. It's called fiscal.wa.gov. Again, that's fiscal.wa.gov. That will give you all state spending over time, and you can search just by an agency, and it allows you to create your own graphics or charts that you can download and then publish.
Next, that's an amazing tool, by the way. Next question regarding capital gains income tax legislation. One, can emergency clause be contested after the passage? And two, if the bill passes, what is the outlook for the Supreme Court ruling wholly against it?
So, I mean, technically a legal challenge could be filed, but again, because of that Mariner Stadium precedent, the Supreme Court just made it clear that whatever the legislature says, and in fact, one of the dissenting justices in the opinion said that the court has just eviscerated the people's right of referendum with this ruling. So yeah, you can challenge it, but you're probably not going to win. What is the court going to do on this? I think we mentioned this a little bit earlier. You cannot look at this bill. You can't look at the incidence of the tax and not find it to be an income tax. A court is not going to be able to call this an excise tax. So the question is, well, what do they do next? That's what's up for debate. That's what the left is hoping opens the door to graduate income tax. I still feel confident, though, that if they were willing to do this, they would have accepted the Seattle case last year, But again, you just don't want to take the chance.
Next question. Do you think the Seattle Times editorial against the income tax on capital gains today will have any effect on legislators?
Yes, I mean, the more public outcry there is against this, the more likelihood it doesn't move. And we know this because if you recall a few years ago, thankfully this failed because I was able to get the emails from lawmakers showing their motivations for the income tax. But you may recall the legislature tried to pass a law exempting itself from public records. And the public came unglued, so much so that the governor was forced to veto that bill. So if you get a strong enough public outcry, it can impact things. And I will say that the longer this stays in rules and the closer we get to the revenue forecast, the more likely this doesn't move.
That brings me to a follow-up I wanted to have you address, which is that there was a press availability yesterday that you took special note of. And the media seemed surprisingly interested in the amount of revenue coming in and the context of people being in lockdown and prohibited from doing business or having a lot of limitation on employment prospects and other things. One, what are your thoughts on the media coverage of the income tax on capital gains so far? And could you give us a recap of the media availability yesterday and what made it remarkable?
My frustration about this debate over the past 10 years, it always comes down to Republicans say and Democrats say. That's not this debate. It's sponsors of the bill and the rest of the world, right? I would love to see an analysis of, well, what does the IRS say? What does every state say? What does every tax professional say versus it just be Republicans versus Democrats? So that's part of the coverage that frustrates me a little bit. As far as yesterday's press availability, it was something I haven't seen before because they just didn't have a good answer for why they were declaring an emergency on this bill, why you weren't going to wait for the revenue forecast that was going to increase before moving a tax bill, why all we have heard all sessions about how regressive our taxes are, yet you're passing a soda tax, which is the epitome of a regressive tax. So it was an interesting press conference from their inability to pivot away from their talking points to address these press questions.
It's interesting. I reshared something that you wrote in 2018. I think it was the end of 2018, where you were recommending, cuts to the sales tax. And I've noted in all the talk of regressive taxation burdens, we still don't see a big groundswell of support for your policy recommendation of cutting this, using some of the revenue growth to cut the sales tax. And we should point out, revenue growth and spending in the state has increased enormously over the last 7-8 years. I mean, just in a huge way.
Yeah, and the Pew Center actually came out with a report last week that showed Washington, I think, was one of 3 states in the country that actually saw revenue growth in 2020 while everybody else was seeing drops. So again, tweaks and reforms are needed to our tax structure. It does not need to be blown up.
If it ain't broke, tax it. That's the Washington way. Next question. Is there any data that shows taxes percent per capita, not including the people with net worth of $1 billion or more?
So the Department of Revenue does have a report called Tax Statistics that provides the state revenue on 2 calculations, per personal income and by per capita, but it does not tease that out by income ratio.
Next question. Why doesn't the media cover the legislative sessions anymore? I'll answer very briefly on that one, Jason, and then turn it to you for any additional comment. One is there's been such a giant, enormous shift in the way media works and their business model that local coverage is in total has diminished considerably. I mean, there used to be a lot of different papers sending individual reporters to Olympia, and that has just that has gone down to a tiny handful covering everything in Olympia all at once. And it's a sad, I think, development of part of that shift in the market of media and the rise of the internet, which makes, bloggers and I think organizations like Washington Policy Center vastly more important because, following Washington Policy Center's blog, that's where a lot of people can learn details about legislative session they might miss otherwise. You can also follow it yourself via washingtonvotes.org, our nonpartisan service that we have, where you can track specific pieces of legislation. But it's really a matter of there's a diminishing and ever smaller a number of people involved in local media coverage because newspapers can't afford them anymore.
Yeah, when I started doing this work, I think 20 years ago, there were 30 reporters called the Capitol Press. I think we have 10 now. And again, you have hundreds of bills and you get maybe 2 days notice of what the legislature is doing. Try having 10 people cover everything that's happening in the legislature. There's just not enough time.
Next question. I may have missed this response, but what's the status of stripping the governor of his right to extend the lockdown without the authority of the legislature? He did miss this one, but I thought we'll repeat it just in case you entered late for the event.
Yeah, so the status is those bills are dead, but nothing is truly dead until sine die. So if the public cares about this, they have got to get legislative leadership to move it.
How do we get rid of the emergency clause? The reality is that Democrats, liberals don't care about the people of Washington, nor do they care about whether they drive out businesses and opportunities. They just want power. So how do we expose those power hungry? And he goes on to describe in quite detail his dismay over one party there. One, let me follow up there. Do you think it's an issue of not caring, or is it something else? And two, address the issue of the emergency clause.
I think it's just like with title-only bills. A lawmaker does not want to self-restrain their ability to do what they want to do, right? That's why you use title-only bills. That's why you use emergency clause. That's why you waive the 5-day public notice requirements to move a capital gains income tax with 2 days notice over a holiday weekend, right?
Right.
Can it change? Yes, but the mechanism requires the legislature to self-impose those restrictions on themselves. On the emergency clause, it's going to require a constitutional amendment. On the other things I mentioned, conceivably, you could pass an initiative to try to put these restraints on the legislature, but that itself might be subject to a legal challenge because the Constitution does allow the legislature to set its own rules.
Yeah, in my experience, it's not about people not caring. It's a matter of defining, what you mean by caring, and whether or not you want people to have, choices in terms, or if you have confidence that choosing for themselves is the best policy. Because a lot of times you want people to do a certain thing, and other people have different priorities, and sometimes that's hard for people to accept. What about with the legislative session the way it is right now? Do you have any guesses for what else we might expect in the coming legislative session? And do you think that if the capital gains income tax passes, and let's say the court says the court rules against all precedent, what happens then?
So first, what's going to happen next in session? When you tell me, because this session has not followed any rules. I mean, from it being a remote session to moving tax bills before the revenue forecast to being told we're going to have restraints on the bills that are being proposed. You have multiple versions showing up in the House and the Senate, very clearly not communicating. I honestly have no idea what to expect next. The session has just broken all of the rules. As far as what happens should things go totally sideways and the income tax passes and the court upholds it, again, we have the right of initiative. We can run a bill and saying, no, thank you. Once again, we don't want an income tax.
What do you see as in the revenue forecast? Do you see if let's say we get the additional $1 billion that you're expecting coming in, does that leave the desires of the legislature satiated in terms of reducing the number of the taxes that you mentioned that would increase, or would you expect all those tax increases to still be on the table for one reason or another?
If you remember, the voters, I believe, on 6 separate occasions passed a requirement that it take a supermajority vote of the legislature to raise taxes. And that constantly got suspended or repealed by the legislature, and we would repass it. And the court finally tossed it. Since the Supreme Court tossed that taxpayer restriction every single year, no matter what, billions of surpluses, a pandemic, tax increases have been on the table. So unfortunately, I don't think the lawmakers will be any restrained in what they're proposing. The question is there enough public outrage over the fact you've got a balanced budget, you've got strong revenue growth, we're in the midst of still trying to recover our economy from businesses that have been ordered closed by the government. Are you seriously trying to raise taxes?
Next question. Where is the government under control? It seems like much of it currently is out of control.
I think the state parks are pretty nice.
Well, they were closed for quite a while. I mean, during the COVID lockdown, in some places you couldn't go out in the middle of the wilderness and just got to hang out. So I felt like even that was out of control by definition. So, Jason, in terms of following this session, one of the things that I've noted is I think the steam for Washington Policy Center coverage and for your analysis in particular has actually been increasing in acceptance and in credibility. And I know you're a modest guy and you don't want to say anything about that, but has your relationship with lawmakers and the media changed at all over the course of the last couple of years? Including those who might not necessarily typically agree with you?
I think this is the benefit for all of the researchers at the policy centers. We don't deal in talking points. It's data, it's facts, and the data and facts are what they are, right? We hear a lot about follow the data, follow the science, and that's what we're providing. And a lot of people can get frustrated when you confront them on their talking points. We don't have to worry about that because we have the actual facts on our side. And that makes it a little bit harder to discount.
There's a number of questions that have come up regarding bills that Washington Policy Center doesn't actually cover in topics. We mentioned law enforcement earlier. I would like to remind people that we do have the Washington Vote Service, where if you go to washingtonvotes.org, not only can you get twice weekly updates about what's happening in the legislature, it's a nonpartisan service. You can sign up and track bills or your own legislators. Specifically, you can watch how they're voting on everything. You can follow any piece of legislation you want. Just go to washingtonvotes.org and you can follow that there. I'd also like to remind you that the video of this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page coming up within the next 24 to 48 hours or so. So if you saw something that you want to share with others and you want people to know about it, you can do it there, or you can get the written versions. Just go to washingtonpolicy.org, and we have a What You Need to Know page about the income tax. A lot of the information that we talked about on the income tax on capital gains is right there. We have a couple of animated explainer videos that go through what Jason talked about in terms of why an income tax on capital gains is bad policy and why this is not an excise tax, but an income tax. It's right there for you. Also, for those of you who are watching but are not members of Washington Policy Center, I'd encourage you to donate to Washington Policy Center, to join us, be a member. You can do a trial 6-month membership, I believe. It's on the website. Just go to washingtonpolicy.org, go in and click the donate page or become a member page and see what options work for you. But then you can become an active member of Washington Policy Center. You can follow our work, get our weekly email. And I'd encourage you to go to our blog at the very least, because you will get information about the legislative session that you might not have seen anywhere else. And that's whether you agree with the general outlook of Washington Policy Center or not, gives you an idea of the direction things are headed and gives you a point of view that you might not have considered at all until you see it at Washington Policy Center. And that includes a lot of different areas of policy in the state, including transportation, worker rights, the obviously budget and policy, the environment. We have a small business center, agriculture, education, and so forth. Jason, as always, it's been just a pleasure. I'm always amazed at your grasp and knowledge of the legislative process and all that's happening in Olympia. And I know you have very little spare time during a crazy legislative session. So I'm going to let you get back to work, so to speak. But thank you so much.
Always time for you, Dave, and the members. And members, keep your eye out for some fantastic income tax ads that Mr. Bowes has created. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, we've got some of those visuals up if you want to see our visuals on the income tax issue. Again, you just go to washingtonpolicy.org and you can see all those things there and share them. We've got some new political cartoons. One of them should be released later on today, which should be a little bit of fun. Not something the Washington Policy Center typically releases, but we've got another one that you can see there, kind of harkening back to 1980s Gremlins, which is a bit of fun. And also, other shareable things, including that petition, Keep Washington Income Tax Free. You can get the link to the petition either in the chat function, where you can see there, or just go to the homepage, What You Need to Know section right there at the top of the page. Thank you so much for joining us again. This is a weekly series, so next Tuesday, same time, We'll do a Facebook Live event. It's Legislative Lunchbox with Chris Cargill, our Eastern Washington director, next week. And then I'll be back the following week with another Olympia Watch, Washington Policy on the Go. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope you do again.